In the 1980s, Japanese workers were showing up to clinics with a strange, unofficial diagnosis: too much city, not enough anything else. Overwork, overstimulation, a kind of exhaustion that didn't have a single clear cause. The government's response wasn't a new medication. It was a walk in the woods, studied seriously enough to eventually get its own name and its own research budget. That name is Shinrin-yoku, usually translated as forest bathing, though nobody's actually getting wet. It simply means spending deliberate, unhurried time immersed in a forest environment, paying attention with your senses rather than walking through it while thinking about something else entirely. Stress doesn't announce itself the way a broken bone does. It shows up quietly, as tension that's always somehow present in the shoulders, sleep that doesn't feel restorative even after enough hours, a low simmer of irritability that doesn't seem tied to anything specific. A lot of it is genuinely hard to pin down, which is exactly why a habit that can be measured, at least to some degree, is worth paying attention to. This tends to matter more, not less, as the decades go by. Chronic stress and its physiological companions, including elevated cortisol over long periods, are associated with a wide range of effects on the body, from disrupted sleep to changes in skin and energy that often get filed away simply as aging. It's rarely one single dramatic event doing the damage. It's closer to a slow accumulation of days that never quite got a chance to reset, one after another, for years. This isn't a story about Japan discovering some mystical connection to nature the rest of the world lacks. Forests exist everywhere, and plenty of cultures have their own traditions of finding calm outdoors. What's specific to Japan here is that this particular habit got taken seriously enough to actually study, and what that research has found is worth understanding on its own terms, without inflating it into something bigger than it is. Let's talk about what actually happens during a session like this, because the mechanism matters more than the label. I've written a guide that compels the daily habits Japanese women have followed for generations to age more slowly, stay active, and maintain healthy skin and a strong body well into their 80s. It's called Still Young in Japan, and I'd love to help you do the same. Right now, the guide is 98 pages long, but everyone who purchases it this month will receive all new chapters added over the next few weeks completely free of charge. Scan the QR code or click the link below to get your copy and start aging on your own terms today. The first thing worth knowing is that this isn't simply exercising outside. Studies comparing forest walks to walks of similar length and pace in urban settings have found measurably different effects on markers like cortisol, the hormone most closely associated with the body's stress response. Several Japanese studies, particularly research associated with Dr. Ching Li, have found reductions in salivary cortisol following time spent in forest environments, with different studies reporting different magnitudes of change depending on the setting and the specific measurement used. It's worth being honest here, rather than quoting a single dramatic number. The reductions found across this research generally range from roughly 10 to 20% or more in various studies. Not because it's a moving target designed to sound impressive, but because that's genuinely what a body of real research looks like. A range rather than a single tidy figure. Anyone quoting one exact number as a universal guarantee is simplifying more than the science actually supports. The second point is about why a forest specifically, rather than any outdoor space. Trees release compounds called phytoncides, natural airborne chemicals that are part of a tree's own defense system against insects and decay. Some research has examined whether inhaling these compounds during forest exposure is associated with changes in immune markers and stress hormones. And while this research is genuinely interesting, it's also still developing, and it would be overstating things to claim phytoncides alone explain everything Shinrin-yoku appears to do. It's one plausible piece of a larger picture, rather than the entire explanation. The third point, and possibly the most practically useful one, is what a forest environment removes rather than what it adds. Notifications, screens, traffic noise, decision-making, the low-grade mental multitasking that fills most modern days, all of it drops away almost entirely once you're surrounded by trees rather than a to-do list. Some researchers argue that this reduction in constant sensory and cognitive demand may be doing at least as much work as anything specifically tied to being in nature itself. This is worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over. It's genuinely difficult to fully separate "the forest did this" from "the absence of your phone for 40 minutes did this," and the two are very likely working together rather than as competing explanations. Consider a woman named Emmy in her early 60s who started taking a slow, deliberate walk through a small forested park near her home most weekends, not as exercise, and specifically without her phone. She isn't trying to hit a step count or burn a particular number of calories. She's simply walking slowly enough to notice the texture of bark, the specific sound wind makes moving through leaves rather than concrete, the smell of damp earth after rain. She'd likely describe the effect as feeling more like herself again by the time she gets home, rather than being able to point to any single measurable change. It's worth noting she didn't start this because a doctor prescribed it or because she read the research behind it. She started because a friend suggested it on a particularly overwhelming week, and it simply stuck around afterward, the way a genuinely useful habit often does. The fourth point is about accessibility. Since not everyone has a forest within easy reach, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest, research on green space more broadly, including urban parks, tree-lined streets, and even smaller pockets of green within cities, has found associations with lower reported stress and improved mood, generally with smaller effects than deep forest exposure, but real effects nonetheless. If a genuine forest isn't accessible, a well-treed park, a botanical garden, or even a quiet green corner of a city can offer a meaningful, if more modest, version of the same idea. The goal isn't a specific postcard-perfect forest. It's deliberate time spent with attention turned toward a natural environment rather than a screen. The fifth point is about how much time this actually requires, since one of the biggest barriers to any wellness habit is assuming it demands more than it does. Much of the research behind Shinrin-yoku uses sessions somewhere between 15 and 40 minutes, not a full day, not a weekend retreat. A 20-minute walk during a lunch break or a weekend morning is a genuinely reasonable, evidence-aligned target, far more achievable for most people's actual schedules than the vague idea of getting back to nature might initially suggest. The sixth point deserves honesty rather than over-promising. This isn't a treatment for clinical anxiety, depression, or diagnosed stress-related conditions, and it isn't a substitute for therapy, medication, or professional care when those are genuinely needed. What the research reasonably supports is more modest and still meaningful. Time spent attentively in a natural setting may support lower perceived stress, and some physiological markers associated with it, as one piece within a broader approach to managing day-to-day stress, not as a standalone cure for anything more serious. If stress or anxiety feels persistent, overwhelming, or is affecting daily functioning, that's worth discussing with a doctor or mental health professional rather than relying on a walk alone to resolve it. It's also worth addressing the weather excuse directly, since it's usually the first thing that quietly ends this habit before it starts. A light rain, an overcast sky, or a slightly cold morning doesn't cancel the benefit, and some people report the sensory experience is actually more distinct on a quiet, damp day than a busy, bright one. The habit doesn't require ideal conditions nearly as often as convenient excuses suggest it does. Dressing appropriately and going anyway, rather than waiting for a perfect afternoon that may not arrive for weeks, tends to matter more than most people assume. There's also a simple way to know whether a given walk is actually working the way this is intended to, without needing any equipment or measurement. Notice your breathing before you start, and notice it again halfway through. A shift towards slower, deeper breaths, without deliberately trying to control them, is often a reasonably reliable sign that the nervous system is settling, even without a lab measuring cortisol at the same time. There's a broader point worth naming here because it echoes something true about most of what this channel has ever covered. The habits that actually hold up under research tend to be less dramatic than the headlines built around them, and more useful for exactly that reason. A 20-minute walk without your phone, done regularly, isn't going to make anyone's highlight reel. It's also considerably more realistic to sustain over years than almost anything sold as a quick fix. None of this is about presenting Japan as uniquely connected to nature, or every other culture as somehow missing this. Forests and green spaces exist worldwide, and the calming effect of time spent in them has likely been understood informally by people everywhere, long before anyone gave it a Japanese name or measured it in a lab. What Japan specifically contributed is decades of dedicated research, asking a simple question seriously. Does this actually do anything? And if so, how much? That question, and the honest, still developing answers to it, are what make this worth trying, not a claim of exclusive access to something the rest of the world lacks. If there's one thing worth taking from this, it's permission to treat an ordinary walk as something worth doing on purpose, rather than something to rush through on the way to somewhere else. Leave the phone at home, or at least in a pocket you don't reach into. Notice something specific, a smell, a sound, the texture of a leaf. Give it 20 minutes before deciding whether it did anything. Healthy aging was never really about eliminating stress altogether, since some of that simply isn't possible or realistic for most lives. It's about building in small, reliable ways to interrupt it regularly enough that the accumulation doesn't get the final word. Sometimes that looks like a walk among trees. Sometimes it's simply the quiet that comes from putting the phone down for 20 unremarkable minutes and letting that be enough. Try it this week, once, without needing it to be the perfect forest or the perfect day. Notice how you feel walking in, and notice again walking out. That difference, however small it turns out to be, is usually reason enough to go back next week too.